the final session, ladies and gentlemen. 2.5 days, and what a diversity of methodologies and viewpoints we've been exposed to. The stated objective of this conference, if I recall, was to highlight the key disagreements on future energy challenges. I hope you agree that we have easily achieved that particular goal. One thing that I suspect everyone agrees on is that in order to inform policy decisions that, let's remember, will affect our standards of living 20, 30 years from now, and furthermore, decisions that often will only come to fruition 20 or 30 years from now, renewables being a good example. We need the best possible knowledge and data. So it is an absolute privilege. I could not have imagined a better person to chair a session on the knowledge and data and policy gaps than Professor Charles Hendry. Professor Charles Hendry is no stranger to Edinburgh, being a graduate from the University of Edinburgh. He has also been appointed as a visiting professor at the university's business school and the Academy of Government. A prestigious business career, mostly spent on working at international marketing companies, if I can summarize it like that. Yes. He was first elected to the House of Commons in 1992 and is a member of Parliament for Wealden. And of course, as you all know, he was the Minister for Energy and Climate Change from 2010 to 2012. But his experience and knowledge in energy goes much deeper than that. It should also be mentioned that he was the Shadow Energy Minister from 2005 to 2010. Not to mention the Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party from 2003 to 2005. And he is also currently the Prime Ministerial Trade Envoy to Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan. Now, I don't have to remind this audience what an important role that is for Great Britain right now. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Charles Hendry.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and it's a huge privilege and pleasure for me to be at this conference. As you're saying, that it's 7 years since I took on the energy portfolio for the Conservative Party. I have to say, in all of those years of going to conferences in this country and away, that this is, I think, the most comprehensive programme I've ever seen. It's a fantastic conference, and well done to all of those who've put it together. And as we start to draw the conference to a close, we're looking at some of the gaps. And we've heard now a reference to the difficulties and the disagreements. But what also strikes me the whole time is how many gaps there are in our knowledge and our understanding about the issues which we face and the ways in which we are going to go about addressing them. Many of those are global changes, that if you just go back in the 3 years from when I became minister, at that time, we had the Gulf of Mexico disaster just happening, and all the questions that brought about the ability to explore for oil and gas in difficult areas. Shortly after that, we had Fukushima, bringing a whole question mark to the future of nuclear policy and leading many countries to decide not to continue with nuclear at all. We've had a war in the Middle East, the area which we get most of our gas and oil from today, and all of the implications which that has brought in terms of security of supply. And all of the truisms, as you're told, I've realized that even the truisms change. When I took on that role 7 years ago, I was told that for vehicles, the future was biofuels or electricity. Nobody assumed that the combustion engine could be transformed and made so much more efficient that even luxury cars will now routinely be doing 100 miles to the gallon. People said that gas would always be more profitable than coal. And in the United States, that clearly is the case, but partly because of what has happened in the United States, coal unexpectedly is cheaper than gas here in the United Kingdom, and we're burning extraordinary amounts of coal. It's the major provider of our electricity as we meet here today. And we had the debate then about peak oil and gas. Peak oil dropped off the agenda to some extent. Peak gas is even dropping off the agenda as we realize that there are reserves right around the world, and the challenge for us is, can they actually be harnessed? Can they be brought to market? There are additional challenges which government itself introduces into that equation. And primarily amongst those is the need to decarbonize, the legally binding targets which we have set and other governments have set, that we must reduce our carbon emissions by 80% by 2050, that 15% of all energy in this country must come from renewable sources by 2020. Those are government-imposed targets, but they also bring additional challenges, because the market can decide between two different objectives, between security of supply and affordability. But when you add in a third dimension of low carbon and of climate change, then the government has to take a more active role in those markets to show the relative importance of each of them. So domestically, we need over the next few years to fundamentally rebuild much of our energy and particularly our electricity infrastructure. But at the time when we have the greatest ever need for investment, we also have the greatest ever uncertainty about what each individual technology can deliver. Those domestic decisions are clearly against a background of major international issues as well. The IEA has told us that we're facing a golden age of gas, but then they added, don't expect it to be cheap. It means that we're going to be seeking gas in areas which are increasingly challenging, not just in terms of the rights and wrongs of areas like the Arctic, but in terms of the physical capability of extracting it and the ability to recover the resources which are there. And if they can be recovered, can you actually get them to market? Today we're hearing a decision in Azerbaijan about the TAP pipeline to bring more Azerbaijan gas into the European market. That's very welcome and extremely important. But what about Turkmen gas? Can that be brought into the European market, or will it be going towards China? Will it be going towards Pakistan, India, and Afghanistan? And what about shale gas? Is the United States the model which other countries will follow, or is it the exception? And it'll prove in other countries to be more challenging and more difficult. Will big community incentives be enough to encourage people to accept this in their communities? Or will they be still concerned about a technology which has not been developed onshore in the United Kingdom historically? So there are a number of key questions which our eminent panelists are going to help us address today. Should we diversify, or should we focus on specific technologies? Saudi, Norway, Kazakhstan, some of the most oil and gas-rich countries in the world are themselves developing low-carbon technologies in renewables and nuclear. So if it's right for them, isn't it also right for us? And to what extent do we look at established technologies, or should we be investing in the new technologies of the future? The work which Masdar is doing is world-class in this respect. But there are technologies where the UK can have a global lead in carbon capture and storage, in offshore wind, in marine technologies, where we can get many, many thousands of jobs, where we can be one of the price setters in terms of the cost of those technologies internationally. But would consumers, on the other hand, prefer that we waited until others have developed the technology, they've cheapened it, they've mass-produced it, and would that enable us to have lower cost electricity as we go forward? We are, I think, living in an extraordinary time of invention, but decisions need to be taken now when we don't know the efficiency or the cost efficiency of those different technologies, be that marine and the pioneering work going on here in Scotland, be it energy from waste, be it interconnection and storage, which could transform the reputation of renewables by ensuring that the variability of their output can be backed up by low-carbon sources of electricity from other sources. An entire new debate developing on the role of geoengineering and whether we can reduce climate change through other mechanisms than focusing on decarbonisation. And so we have to look at what choices we and other countries should make. Should nuclear be part of that equation? It is low cost, it's large scale source of low carbon generation. But of course, there are anxieties about it, and many countries have turned away from it. In renewables, we know that the issue here is the variability and the fact that the cost will come down significantly more in the years to come. But how do we balance our security of supply with the consumer's interest in that respect? In coal, where we'd expected much of our coal plant to be coming off the wires, but now, because of the increasing profitability of those old plants, they may opt in to the Industrial Emissions Directive, which will bring us a real challenge in terms of decarbonisation. But if you look at the front pages of our newspapers today, it will help to address the issues of security of supply. And of course, coal is transformed if CCS can be developed, but we don't yet know if it can be developed at scale or at what cost that will happen. And then, of course, gas. Do we need more gas plants to be built? And if so, what is going to be required to make that to happen? Around the world, investors are weighing up the opportunities in different countries. They're trying to understand the opportunities of one versus another, because this is a global market. People will go where the investment returns are going to be best, and they will carefully evaluate what's on offer in each country. And there is a real competitive element. And so do subsidies at the end of the day as well. Are they something for low-carbon technologies, which are going to push up costs to consumers, or are they, as many would argue, a hedge against the inexorable price rises we can expect to see with fossil fuels? We have to decide as well, do we address those issues individually as nations? Do we address them collectively? We see all the climate change talks and the challenges which go with that. Is this the right way in which we should take those debates forward, or should we be looking more towards unilateral targets? So we have with us today three outstandingly good professors who can help us to take us through that debate. And the first one, who I'm delighted to introduce, is Professor Michael Jefferson, who is studied at, it's always, when you've just said he is one of the most eminent professors in the world, and then you mix up his name. But he studied at University College, Oxford, and then the London School of Economics. He went into industry and he became chief economist of the Royal Dutch Shell Group, and he spent nearly 20 years in Shell. He then spent 10 years as Deputy Secretary General of the World Energy Council, where he began working with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as a contributing author. He's a visiting professor in the School of Humanities at the University of Buckingham, and he's a member of the Technical Advisory Group of the Renewable Energy Foundation. He's visiting professor at the London Metropolitan University, and he's Professor of International Business and Sustainability in the Centre for International Business and Sustainability at the London Metropolitan Business School. Professor Michael Jefferson, it's a pleasure to hear you.
I'm going to be very brief because I think most of you will have already had 50 minutes or so of me already this morning. So just to recap on some of the things as they link in with what Charles has just been telling us. Diversifying into the various sources of new technologies, alternative technologies. Yes, of course, that must happen. The problem is at the moment that, for instance, in the UK, our subsidy system really pushes more the conventional new renewable energy technologies. It is not really pushing the seriously advanced ones. I mean, where are we, for instance, on the support for second and third generation biofuel technologies? What have we actually done to help advance wind energy technologies? Solar PV systems. So, you know, the more closer you come to home, I think the more depressing the story is about the support. CCS has been mentioned by Charles and by other speakers today, but of course the capacity to put carbon sequestrated into depleted oil and gas wells is very limited, or indeed into coal mines. Yes, subsea aquifers potentially could be very big, but we've hardly begun to scratch the surface on that. Marine technologies, yes, not estuarine barrage, please, but again, I think rather limited potential overall. I mean, tidal stream in a few places, wave in a few places. OTEC has always been looked at in one particular small area of the globe, but again, limited. Do consumers prefer to wait? Well, of course, if there are costs involved, they would prefer to defer them. And the tougher the financial crisis, the longer it goes on for, the greater their preference to wait. Yes, we do live in extraordinary times, but as I said earlier on, at the global, the regional, the national, the local level, actually the story of the policies and the economics is pretty shambolic. Suboptimal decisions being taken on the location of wind energy developments, of solar PV systems. planning inspectors who give permission for the simple burning of palm oil in the middle of England. I mean, how crazy can you get? The role of geoengineering, I'm not going to touch on. Professor Salter is right there waiting. He's not just a man for ducks. Should nuclear be part of the future? Well, I can't see how that can be avoided. I know, you know, we're all concerned about operational safety. We're concerned about accidents. We're concerned about terrorism. We are concerned, obviously, about waste disposal as well, although, of course, it has been pointed out that CO2 is a pretty large, potentially dangerous sink as well. The intimacy of renewables we've touched on, and I touched on this morning about the gross exaggerations of the performance of wind energy in the UK, not so much in Scotland, but gross exaggerations of performance in central England. We've got to keep to the facts and examine not only the past record, but future potential. Coal and CCS, well, it's a difficult subject. I'd rather pass on that. And I think I've got pretty much down your list. But basically, as most of you realize, I've been around a sufficiently long length of time. I'm not very optimistic. And if I may say so, your old department is, I think, a bit hidebound. Alistair Burt, my MP, has been trying to set up a meeting of a number of us to go in and meet not Ed Davey. I've heard Ed Davey speak about how these things don't matter, you know, because the developer only gets paid for electricity he produces, but another minister. Well, we're still waiting. We're 7-8 months on. We've been promised one thing and then another, one date and then another. And frankly, we need to open up the Department of Energy and Climate Change. We've got David Mackay there, who's got a pretty good idea of what's going on, but he's not being listened to as far as I can see.
When you say you've been waiting for 7 or 8 months for a meeting, I'm glad to say that I left 10 months ago, so I wasn't part of that delay. But certainly I agree with what you say about David Mackay, who I think brought outstanding understanding to the work of the department. Our next contributor is Professor Zoe Shipton from the University of Strathclyde. Zoe is a Professor of Geological Engineering at the Department of Civil Engineering at Strathclyde, and that she was a senior lecturer at the University of Glasgow in the Department of Geographical and Earth Sciences, and previously also at Trinity College, Dublin. She has a PhD from the University of Edinburgh in geology, and she's a member of the Royal Society and the Royal Academy of Engineering's working group on shale gas. Zoe.
Thank you very much. I actually came to this conference not quite knowing what to expect. This isn't my field. I'm a geologist by training. I have an interest in CCS, conventional and unconventional hydrocarbons, geological disposal of radioactive waste, geothermal, and my latest little tangent, you can tell I go on lots of tangents, is thinking about risk and uncertainty and public communication of science. I don't know anything about energy systems, modelling and energy policy, and I've learnt a huge amount. This has been an absolutely fascinating conference with people giving really excellent contributions from so many different directions. It's been a real eye-opener. Before I came here, I sat down and I thought, well, what are the brief was knowledge gaps. So I thought, what are the 3 knowledge gaps that without having seen any of these talks that I could see as being important for global energy systems, and I'm quite pleased to say that I got them all sort of right. So while I've been here, I've been busily adjusting my thinking and I've come up with these 3 points that I want to make, and 2 of them are quite technical. I'm a scientist and an engineer, and one of them is a bit more broad about policy and public understanding. So I'm going to start off on geology. I am a geologist. We're sitting at Dynamic Earth, which is Scotland's Museum of Geological Wonders. And I want to talk about the kind of geological knowledge gaps that we have. And we have had decades of experience of understanding the world beneath our feet, driven by the need to understand conventional hydrocarbons. And conventional hydrocarbons, we talk about petroleum system. There was a fantastic talk on Wednesday about this. We need to understand what the source of the oil is, where it goes, and what stopped it from keep on going up to the surface, the cap rock. And petroleum systems mainly focuses on that story and then on the reservoir, on how easy it is to produce from that tank that's holding the hydrocarbons. And there's there is relatively little known about the cap rock itself. The reason is that if it's leaked, it leaked millions of years ago and you don't care, it's gone up to the surface, been eaten by bacteria. Similarly, once it's there, in order to produce it well, you need to know about the sandstone or whatever that it's sitting in. So amazingly, there is virtually no core through shale rock, the kind of rock that forms a cap rock in conventional hydrocarbons, to the extent that the British and Norwegians are now actually renting a rig to go, or proposing to rent a rig to go and drill get some core back so we can actually look at how it works. For effective CCS and shale oil and gas extraction, we need to understand the physical properties and the fluid flow properties of that rock in order to understand how good it is at trapping CO2 and how frackable it is. How can we improve our recovery factors for shale oil and gas? Secondly, to convince the public that things like CCS and nuclear are good solutions to our waste problem, our waste carbon and our waste radioactive waste, we need to look at what the petroleum systems people call the overburden. They just dismiss it. It's the stuff on top of what we care about. Well, for CCS and rad waste, it's exactly what we care about. It's the stuff that the CO2 or the radioactive waste-bearing groundwater might move through to bring those contaminants back up to the surface. And we know virtually nothing about the overburden. The petroleum people don't drill it, or they drill through it, but they don't core it, they don't particularly log it, they don't care about it. Again, because once your petroleum's leaked out of a conventional reservoir, it leaked, it's gone. So we need to do a lot more to understand the geology and to develop new tools for site characterisation. If we're going to store CO2, we need to be confident that it's not going to come back up to the surface or go sideways into a producing oil or gas field. So we need to do a lot of work on understanding that part of the geology, part of our planet that we don't know much about. And it's not just important for the deep Earth, not in terms of kilometres. So in the 90s, the Telford Institute produced a report on civil engineering that said that a third of large civil engineering projects are delayed. That's not probably any surprise to you. But 50% of those delays are due to inadequate understanding of the ground, meaning the top few hundred metres. And this is crucial. If you're going to be installing wind turbines, you need to know what the geology is, or the geomorphology, the geography, the soil part. If you're going to be installing big infrastructure projects in terms of pipelines, I don't know how many of you know that the pipeline, the Trans-Alaska pipeline, crosses a massive fault. And when there was an earthquake in Alaska in 2001, they put the pipeline on railway. And when the fault moved like this, the pipeline distorted. So it's a fantastic engineering solution to a challenge that you only get if you understand the geology underneath your engineering. So that probably sounds like me banging the drum for geology, and you've got to fund lots of geology. But as Titania Mitrova said on the first day, it's not just the under-the-ground factors that define production problems. So the second point I want to make is about public and policymaker understanding of these incredibly complicated and interconnected science, engineering, economic and social factors behind energy systems. And in my view, sometimes the lack of understanding in the public and the policymakers is as big a barrier to the success of these projects as actually understanding the science, the engineering and so on itself. And I personally think that one thing that might kill shale gas in this country is public opposition. Not the geology, not the engineering, not the finance. It's going to be people saying, I don't want this in my backyard. And we've heard a few times today about NIMBYs, this week, about NIMBYs and NUMBYs, not under my backyard, NOMBYs, not over my backyard. And one of the things I want to emphasise is that there's this tendency to talk about public understanding as if the public was this sort of faceless mass of people that all had one opinion. And we know that's demonstrably not true. So we know that in places like Cumbria, where the regional council just rejected radioactive waste, whereas the two local councils said, yes, please, we'll take it. We want to go on to the next stage of the volunteerism process. That we were looking at the local people who could see the benefit from jobs and infrastructure investment, and the more regional people who could see the reputational risk to them as politicians. They could see a more wide-ranging tourist risk because they were living in places with tourism rather than places with unemployment. And the public is this incredibly diverse group of people who have different opinions and need to be spoken to in different ways. and we need to speak to them in ways that they understand. So I want to have a case study here that's lifted from the shale gas, the Royal Society Royal Academy of Engineering shale gas report. So several times this week we've heard that one of the problems of shale gas is that it's very water intensive. Okay? Now we're hopeless at working out big numbers. Somebody talked about zettajoules earlier, but actually there's 1,000 joules, there's several thousand, I think 4,000 joules in a Mars bar. So zettajoules isn't as big a number as it sounds. So let's think about water in shale gas. A hydraulically fractured well that lasts for 10 years, it has to be refract because to keep the decline curve from disappearing, will use 5 million US gallons of water. That's close to 20,000 cubic meters of water. What an enormous number, right? Well, that's what you use to water a golf course for a month. I don't know whether that golf course is in an arid area or a rainy area, but that's the statistic from the 2012 Policy Exchange report. It's the amount of water that you need to run a gigawatt coal-fired power station for 12 hours. And it's the amount that United Utilities loses in water loss from their water plants in the northeast of England every hour. So actually, is that a large amount of water? And can we actually raise the debate by talking to people in terms that they understand? Now actually, you'll probably find that some people go for the golf course statistic. They play golf, they like golf, they think that's really interesting. Other people think, oh wow, the United Utilities, that's the one that makes me interested. But if you're a power station operator and you know about coal power stations, maybe that's the one that floats your boat. So we need to find a way of talking to different publics in a way that they're going to understand. And if we steer away from this significant challenge of educating the public about the real science and engineering challenges behind our energy systems, then can we blame them for campaigning to effectively what Kevin too on the first day suggested, was where people are campaigning to export the environmental problems to countries that have a less good environmental regulatory system or even a less good human rights record. We can't really blame people for doing that if they really don't understand the level of risk. We also, as Peter Dryberg said yesterday, we need to increase the level of knowledge amongst policymakers and opinion formers. And policymakers, by and large, are not scientifically or engineering educated. There's very few scientists and engineers in the House of Parliament. But they're clever people, and they just need people to tell them what's going on in a language that they understand. Civil servants rotate round very rapidly around different departments. So just about the time they've got the level of understanding to get to grips with the problem, then they're off to health or they're off to something else. So we need to again, communication is important. The media are often attacked for dumbing down and giving emotive stories. Well, actually, with my experience with the shale gas thing is that these people from some newspapers that I really wouldn't want to be seen dead reading are actually very clever people. And again, they may not be scientists or engineers, they're educated and they want to know the answers to the questions. They ask some really, really excellent science questions. So one of the things I want to say, this is a bit of a nag now. So this conference has been fantastic. I've learnt a lot. There have been some fantastic talks. The one just before lunch, I nearly didn't go because the title sounded so out of my field, but I learnt so much. But there have been other talks that have been very technical that I thought, you could have explained that better. There have been people I've talked to in the conference that have said, I didn't go to that because it wasn't interesting. And I think if we can't communicate these very complex things, if you can't communicate within a group of people who, let's face it, have paid to be in this room, then what hope have we got in communicating it to the public and policymakers? So I think academia and institutes around these issues need to step up to the plate here and get better at that communication. So finally, I probably rattled on way too long. For a conference on global energy systems, I think we've heard really quite little about the developing world. We've heard a lot about the UK and the US and North America, a lot about China and Russia, a bit about India, nobody's mentioned Brazil, but we've heard virtually nothing about the developing world. And one of the questions after last night's debate was, what about the 20% of the global population that don't have any access to energy at all? Now at Strathclyde, there are engineering students who are developing low-cost and low-maintenance solutions to things like really cheap photovoltaic systems that you can mend with bits of cable ties and stuff. They don't have any petrol, they don't have cars, they can't phone up a mechanic and say, come and mend my PV. They do have phones, because in Africa, people have skipped landlines and they've gone straight to mobiles. And one of my final point I want to make is that there's a really interesting opportunity in countries where we're starting from scratch. So we've got huge problems in the UK of retrofitting our system, and how do we deal with intermittency and distributed generation. We don't have that problem in Africa because there ain't a system to retrofit. So how are we going to start from scratch in these countries and build a system that's carbon neutral and can deliver the energy that we need for growth? I don't know how many of you noticed, but if you come up the big sweeping thingy up to the front door, there's a sign that says the present is the key to the future. Now that's paraphrasing one of the greatest Scottish geologists of all time, James Hutton, who said the present is the key to the past, i.e. we can understand the geology. And we heard a talk this morning about how we can use these sort of past trends in industrialisation and the move to service economies to predict the future. But actually, I think one of my questions is, can we? I'm not a modeller, but can we? I mean, are we going to do that? Is Africa going to go through an industrial revolution? So I'll leave it there. I think I've probably gone on too long. But thank you very much.
So that was absolutely fascinating, and thank you very much indeed. And our final speaker, Professor Stephen Salter, who's the Professor of Engineering Design at the University of Edinburgh, and who's the inventor of the eponymous Salter duck, as well as being deeply involved in geoengineering solutions and one of the leading proponents of that technology. Stephen.
Thank you. We were sent a list of questions to sort of steer this session, and I'm going to try and answer them. And the first one was, what forms of top-down interventions are required? And I think the problems at the moment are we have, if you want to really succeed in a big corporation, you have to actually be a psychopath, and that means that big corporations tend to behave in psychopathic ways. If you're a politician, you have to get re-elected. And the combination of these two things leads to perhaps unsatisfactory leadership of the problems. Now, I don't want to go for a totalitarian government, but Joe Stalin did arrange enormous transformations of Russia from a very primitive society to space and nuclear technology. He did this by promising to shoot the program directors if they didn't do if it didn't work out. I'm not saying Pol Pot, come back, all is forgiven. But what we need is somebody at the top, about like Beaverbrook. If you look at Beaverbrook's achievements in producing aircraft in 1940, he really annoyed the Air Ministry, but he was backed up by Churchill. We need somebody who really wants the thing to work. And certainly in the first wave energy program, it was quite clear afterwards that the people who were leading it wanted it to fail. Did all sorts of nasty tricks. The next question is, are nuclear and renewables able to prevent drastic climate change? And the answer to that is no. It could have been done if we'd worked steadily right from the 70s, but it's too late. I think carbon dioxide that we've released already has not had anything like its full effect, and there's methane coming out of the Arctic at much, much higher rates. Methane used to contribute about a third of the global warming. Now it's up to about a half of it. And there's a lot of methane stacked up in the seabed in the Arctic, and if the Arctic warms, that's coming out. So a way to stop worrying about carbon dioxide is to worry about methane. Snow lines are moving north, and getting the carbon out of the atmosphere is possible, perhaps, but it's very slow. So the next question is, which geoengineering approaches are called for? And there's geoengineering, a very wide term. Some of it's involving getting rid of carbon, which you can do with biochar. Again, it's slow. The quicker ones involve bouncing solar energy back out to space. And there's three ways you can do this. One is impossibly expensive, using satellite mirrors. Another one is to use sulfur in the troposphere, and that lasts a long time, several years. The third way you can do it is to try and make the clouds over the sea be whiter. And the amazing thing about this is how little reflection you need to do, how small an increase you need to solve the problem. We get about 340 watts per square meter coming in to the over 24 hours over the world, and about 1.6 watts of that is excessively being retained because of greenhouse gases. So 1.6 out of 340 is a very small amount. It's enormously big numbers, but tiny differences. And we can make clouds whiter by changing the size distribution of the drops. If you have a lot of small drops, you get a white cloud, and if you've got a small number of big drops, but the same amount of water, then it'll be a lot darker. And we know that already because we say the dark storm clouds are gathering when it's about to be big enough to start raining. And we can do that by spraying tiny drops of seawater, submicron drops. We get a little salt crystal. These get mixed up in the marine boundary layer, and they provide extra nuclei. So instead of having big drops, let's say 25 microns in the cloud, you get a smaller number of drops. Each 25 micron turns into perhaps 219 microns. What's nice about this is that you can choose where and when you do it. And we're now finding out where we can increase precipitation or reduce it. So we might be able to get drought control and flood control out of this if we can do this properly. The next question was, do we have sufficient knowledge? And the answer, of course, is no, we never have enough knowledge about anything. Next question was, is existing knowledge coordinated? And the answer is no, particularly things like wave energy. There are people who are doing wave energy full scale now are getting lots of annoying, very little trivial mistakes, little split pins and seals and things like that, and they're not telling each other about it. They're keeping it secret, with one exception of a company that I work with. They actually are publishing their problems. And what we need is something much more like aircraft, where if there's ever an aircraft crash, everybody in the aircraft industry in the whole world learns everything that can be learned from that. So we need to get much better ways of communicating. The other thing that's incredible is that the IPCC won't use any information that hasn't been in a peer-reviewed journal for 2 years. Now, it takes about a year to get through the peer review process, and if you're going to do some work to report on, that takes quite a while as well. So you could argue that the decisions that the IPCC are passing on to the politicians are at least 4 years out of date. And so far, all the predictions they've made have been wildly wrong. Everything's been happening much more quickly than the IPCC would say. And the reason is this terrible delay. What we need is rapid communication to the decision makers about what's happening, and then they can make up their minds and decide what ought to be changed. What are the major gaps? That's the next question. A gap that I'm particularly keen on is the flow impedance of the Pentland Firth. The Pentland Firth is a very good tidal stream site, and I believe it's much better than most of the people developing the turbines think, and a lot of them don't even know what a flow impedance is. And they are just copying the designs from wind energy, and I think this is wrong if you're in a closed channel. You should be using the equations of hydraulics of turbines in pipes. And this is leading to, I think, the wrong designs where you have big gaps between turbines. The middle of the gap, the water slowed down at the tips of the turbine blades, it's speeded up, and so the wake of a turbine is a very nasty mess of turbulence, which is making it much harder for the turbines in the next row. And so I would like to understand what the flow impedance of the Pentland Firth is. I believe that if you worked out what the present losses on the seabed are, you could work out, and you knew the slope of the water across the Pentland Firth, you'd be able to calculate how the level, the head across the Pentland Firth would change as you put in banks of turbines, and this leads you to a completely different design of turbine. I've had a big problem conveying this idea to the tidal stream industry. The only person who really understands it and actually came to the same conclusion is a chap called David Mackay at the Department of Energy and Climate Change. So he understands this, and we both think that the Pentland Firth could be a very much bigger resource, maybe an order of magnitude bigger than the official estimates. The other thing that's missing, I think, is a chemical process to produce excess unusable electricity into a liquid fuel for transport. We're going to, if all the renewables happen, we're going to have too much electricity for quite a lot of the time, and we want something sensible to do with it. And what we're going to be short of is liquid fuels. Now, there was a process worked out by the Germans in the 1920s called the Fischer-Tropsch process, and they used it, it was done just for an interesting bit of chemistry then, they used it for real in 1944 after they lost the Romanian oil fields. Something very similar was developed in South Africa when we were threatening to stop them importing oil, and they called it Sasol. And there was a very nice little company over at Westfield in Fife, which was set up by Dennis Rook at the beginning of the North Sea gas glut, and he wanted to have a replacement for gas. And they can turn any carbon-bearing source plus hydrogen into almost any hydrocarbon fuel that you want, including feedstocks for the plastics industry. And what we need to do is to have that really developed so we could do it thoroughly. And what they would like to use is municipal garbage for the carbon source. And if you shove up landfill prices, you make this thing really quite attractive. It's almost on the edge now for making, the best one I want to make is, I think, dimethyl ether, which you can use in a diesel engine. But you can have any mixture of hydrogen and oxygen, a bit of oxygen, and a carbon source put into a great big pot, and different temperatures in different places and different catalysts, and you can get out any hydrocarbon that you want. And I would love to see that happening. So those are the gaps in our understanding. I hope I've answered the questions and kept to time.
Well, Stephen, thank you very much. You've had 3 absolutely extraordinary and fascinating presentations. I'm now delighted to open it to the floor for some comments and some questions. We were scheduled to run till 1 o'clock, but I have a little bit of leeway to run over that if there's particular interest in continuing it. Sir.
I'm still the same guy as yesterday, Maitland Mackey, yes. I don't want to be sound like a wet blanket, so can I just first quickly say how hugely I've enjoyed the conference with a colossal amount of information picked up here, there, and everywhere, of all the bits and energy. However, I just want to challenge the group with this comment that the conference, personally, I believe in the power of the big idea. And there's been very little presentation of the big idea, except that Professor Jefferson was sort of hinting at it. And I would like to see, I think the big idea is simply that all energy in 20 to 30 years could be renewable. There's no question that the exponential curve of development and research, etc., that's taking us down that road is colossally on the way to make that very easily possible, to have all energy. And I think we should be starting groups like this. Don't you agree that we should be starting with this huge idea to get the world to be all renewable energy in 20 to 30 years, and the piece of that, here and there, energy coming out here and there, totally unlimited, and with renewable energy, and also it can't go up in price once it's all renewable energy, because the sun and the wind, it doesn't send out invoices. And I think that's the challenge for conferences like this, and it's not doing it. And just for instance, the last piece, Chair, that I was presenting the power of the big idea at a renewable conference in Fife 3 days ago, and I'm going to challenge Yelta here to put my submission onto the website along with all your other papers for you to criticize as much as I'm going to. No criticism for the papers we've had. There's an awful lot of interesting, but that's all bits here and there. There's not a whole strand through it all that shows what the world could be like. Thank you.
Maitland, thank you very much. So I'm going to take questions in 2s or 3s, then come back to the panel. Gentleman here.
Thank you. I want to sort of go on a slightly different tack here. And it's an issue that we haven't raised at all, also in the course of this conference. We've been talking about systems, but often sort of as distinct silo systems, the energy system as distinct from a water system, etc. I believe that the climate change and the energy transition that we need will be won or lost in cities. And cities is where it all comes together, and they're complex systems. And we haven't discussed how we engage with cities at all as complex systems. So your comments on that would be welcomed.
Very good. And then the gentleman next to you.
Well, strange question this might be. I'm a petroleum chemist, probably the minority in the audience. And I'd like to come back to your idea of Fischer-Tropsch chemistry. I've looked at this on behalf of the company I work for. We've done quite a bit of work on renewables and how we might change our product mix. Fischer-Tropsch is one of those things where you say there's lots of things we can do in chemistry, not all of them make sense, and unfortunately that's where Fischer-Tropsch chemistry falls. If you were to go into taking municipal waste and putting it into a Fischer-Tropsch plant, you will have no end of problems, because unfortunately municipal waste is not a consistent substance. We know that there is one plant planned by British Airways, and I've forgotten the name of the company, it's for London. It's disappeared off the radar. I doubt whether it would ever be built. It certainly won't be economic under any terms whatsoever, because the engineering is so complex. Every Fischer-Tropsch plant that's been promoted, and there was one called Koren in Germany, they've ended up going bankrupt. And the several that are actually operating around the world are, let's say, have some very dubious economics. I was talking with the Shell chap this week who was here giving us a talk about the Pearl project. Pearl was only profitable because Shell do not pay anything for the gas for 10 years. And they're running it on gas, and that is the cleanest, best feedstock that you could put into Fischer-Tropsch. Even Sasol in South Africa have converted their coal Fischer-Tropsch process into a gas-fired process, and that says something.
Okay, Stephen, perhaps you can pick up on that one, and then let's take on the other panel members.
Well, yes, but remember Germany in 1944 really needed aviation fuel, and South Africa was facing an oil embargo. You can make it work if you need to make it work badly enough, and I'm suggesting that maybe we will be wanting to make it work badly enough. And also, we are going to be getting cleverer chemists, and also we are now progressively moving towards more sorting of municipal garbage. We're getting different coloured bins, and you're putting the bottles here and the paper there and the cardboard there. You may have to force this through by having 7 or 8 different colour bins in all the collection processes. So I'm saying that cleverer chemists, better sorting, and a deeper need are what you need, what you have to get this to go.
Okay, Michael.
Well, I'd like to perhaps pick up on the first 2 points. First of all, Mr. Mackey's big idea of 100% new renewables by 2050. It's too big an idea, it's much too unrealistic. Of course, we should be moving towards that, in that direction. And I think the only way in which we've got the slightest chance of getting anything like that sort of number, even getting above 50%, is through concentrating solar power with ultra-high voltage direct current transmission. The direct solar basically is the only channel. Now, of course, you don't have the same social and political problems, hopefully, in the Central American region, the southern United States, or indeed in much of Asia, as you do in North Africa since the Arab dawn, unfortunately. But clearly, if we did have a social political stability in North Africa, southern Mediterranean, to bring it up into Europe, to bring it south into sub-Saharan Africa, then I think we could get towards maybe by 2100 or so on, with all these other things going well, we might begin to approach, well, let's say 75% or something. You know, everything going behind you. It won't, I don't think, so no. Simon, systems are being treated as independent, interrelated, and non-related silos. Urbanisation is a hell of a problem. I mean, 90% of the UK population is urbanised. We're heading to over 50% of the global population being urbanised. Urban populations are the problem. Many parts of the world, little local schemes can provide you with a bit of solar here, a bit of hydro there, a bit of wind somewhere else. Urban populations are the problem. Urban populations are already a big problem for people outside them in terms of, for instance, of anaerobic digesters, placed outside in the country, miles away from the source of where that stuff, that rubbish is being produced. The planning system then says, oh, you've got to go down these narrow country lanes to this out-of-the-way anaerobic digester system. God help if you're coming along the other direction and one of these bloody great refuse vehicles is hurtling towards you at 55 miles an hour. You have to dive into the bloody ditch or you'll be overturned or smashed to pulp. This is the sort of thing that's going on at a very basic level. So, we have got to think in a systemized way. The only way I think urban populations are going to have reliable new renewable provision, again, is through CSP plus ultra-high voltage direct current transmission. That, with the molten salts, we've already got storage for 6 or 7 hours per day on top of the basic thing. Otherwise, frankly, we're going to continue to flounder pretty much in the dark.
Zoe.
One of the things that's often missing from economic models is people. And the reason cities are problems is because they're high densities of people, and changing people's behaviour is incredibly difficult. People don't like change, and short of bringing Joe Stalin back from the dead, we have to put up with that. We have to work around that. I quite like this voluntary and involuntary simplicity, and I'm now going to follow in the previous debate and use a rude word, but when I lived in Dublin, there used to be something that the Dubliners called witches' knickers, which are plastic bags floating around in trees. And they're really ugly, and they're bad for birds that eat them, and they get stuck in the guts and all the rest, and blight on everything. And so the Irish government brought in a plastic bag tax. They also brought in a tax on bin bags. Most people in Dublin leave their bin bags outside the door, and if you left out more bags than you were allowed, you got fined. And people hated it. But within months, the witches' knickers had gone. They've flown off the Atlantic to kill some dolphins or something. But behaviour change is difficult. But as Professor Salter said, you've got to have the political guts to stand up and risk losing your office to bring in things that are unfavourable to the public. And then often what you'll find is everyone says, cool. Wasn't that smoking ban great? I can go to the pub without coming back and stinking. But it does take political will.
Okay, I'm going to bring in 3 more, and then I think we may be out of time. So if we can keep them relatively brief, then we can get through everybody. The gentleman at the front.
Kjell Arnold at Uppsala University. One part of the energy system that we have not discussed is water and desalination of water. And the fact is that the whole Middle East now is more or less going on desalination of water, and that takes a lot of energy available for us to import now, away to import, because they're using it within their own countries for desalination. And the global increase of the population is much, much larger there compared to the rest of the world. So that is another factor that we must look into when it comes to energy system. How could we get a good system to do desalination of water, and because otherwise we will lose a lot of energy that we should need for transportation and so on.
Excellent. Gentleman on the side here.
Yeah, Jim Murray, University of Washington, and in all of these gaps, in all of these issues, I repeatedly don't hear any talk about the transition to scale, and the scales are enormous, whether we're talking about carbon sequestration, where just present-day coal CO2, not oil or any other source, is 30,000 cubic kilometers per year. Niagara Falls is 50 cubic kilometers per year, so that's equal to 600 Niagara Falls per year that we have to sequester, and it's just hard to visualize. With regard to recycling waste, into oil. Maybe we might run a few essential vehicles, but with a global fleet of 1 billion cars, I just have difficulty seeing how we're going to make the transition from, I can view today, and I can view a world that has electric cars with extension cords coming out of every house, but how we're going to get from here to there with a political system where people are elected every 4 years and have to face their electorate. I think such things are achievable in a capitalist dictatorship like China, but it's very difficult in democracies.
Thank you very much. And then down on the aisle towards the back.
Yeah, I'm Mark Wenzel. I'm from the UK Energy Research Centre and Edinburgh University. I'm quite concerned about the way the research community communicates to policy, and I echo kind of Zoe's interest in that. One of my concerns and I think it's been a really interesting conference, but I'm quite concerned about, and it'd be interesting to hear from Charles really, about the policy, kind of how this multiplicity of advocacy for different solutions finds its kind of how it's received in policy. Because we heard about investor sort of inaction in the face of uncertainty, but I suspect that plays out at the policy level as well. So if we're very confused about the transition pathway around decarbonisation, I think the more pressing drivers around energy become those around affordability and security, because they seem more tractable. So what can the research community do, and thinking about the way it communicates to policy, to make this more of a tractable problem and somehow synthesize at the system level where the best evidence is for the pathway?
Thank you. Zoe.
I can answer the last point and actually suggest that the Scottish Government has come up with a really interesting model in the Scottish Government-funded Centre for Expertise in Climate Change, which I'm a member of, so I'm a little bit flying the flag. But the idea is that there's a pool of experts that the Scottish Government can call on. You know, Salmon's on telly in 20 minutes, he needs to know a statistic, or 6-month horizon scanning reports, plus there's funded posts in universities. There's a postdoc sitting here who's working on risk and uncertainty with me. I think this is a global first. And the interesting thing is the amount of education that the policy people have had to do to us to understand what policy is, how it works. We have this lovely idea that the scientists do some science and then they say, hey, policy guy, here's the science, and then they go off and do it. And the PowerPoint slide that the policy guy showed was actually this big fat tangled mess of things, and you know, it's not all simple and logistical. So actually the education needs to go both ways. The Centre for Climate Exchange, it's called, has only been in business for 2 years, so watch this space. But that's maybe one of the approaches that we can take.
Thanks. Michael.
Starting with shale and desalination in the Middle East, I first visited Abu Dhabi, for instance, in 1958. And what I've been aware of, and I was in Bahrain even before that, the traditional Arab architecture, thick walls, inner courtyards to make the best use of the sun or to avoid it as best as possible. The bajil, the wind towers, to capture such wind as there was. The use of water. That's all gone for the most part, except for a few buildings left in museums and for people to visit, in favour of Western-style architecture, glass and concrete, which makes things so much worse and frankly should be stopped. You know, they should go back to Sana'a in Yemen and see how things were going 1,200 years ago. On Jim Murray, yes, I agree with you, very difficult to see how these huge transitions can be achieved in 2, 3, 4 decades. The point being made by from UK Energy Research, UK ERC, again, very confusing. 2 very quick points. Smoking ban, 1608, King James VI of Scotland wrote a thesis, a treatise against the evils of tobacco. As I walk around Edinburgh and any other city or town you like, and I see the younger people smoking, I think, how long does it take for the penny to drop? You know, most people only go back to the US Surgeon General in 1960. And bin bags. Bin bags, I don't have bin bags in my little rural community of 110 people. But if I go along Regent Terrace that wonderful 18th century terrace and centre of Edinburgh overlooking everything else. It's feast day for the seagulls. They were ripping apart the bin bags. They were ripping them apart just down here yesterday. Come on, let's get our act together. If we can't even get it on bin bags, what hope do we have on these other big issues?
Oh, Michael, thank you very much. And Stephen.
I did actually do some work on desalination from the power in sea waves, if anyone would like to have a paper on that. I'm afraid I wasn't able to get any funding to develop it. I'd like to come back to what you were saying about the political structures that you need to solve this problem, and in fact the very great likelihood is that it will be solved in China, where they have about the right mix of forcing something through, a little bit more gentle than Pol Pot, but I think that could be what kills off Western society to the advantage of the Chinese.
Stephen, thank you very much. We need to draw this to a close. There seems to be a general conclusion that totalitarian dictatorships, and particularly brutal ones, are maybe part of the solution, which I'm afraid I will have to back away from. But one thing which does strike me is that within this room and in the people who've attended this conference over the last few days, the extraordinary knowledge which you have is that you are the advocates, you are the ones who can really change this. And as Zoe was saying, as we're hearing from UK ERC, that there is a tremendous need to get this message out to a wider audience, and particularly to young people. I think there is a massive thirst for knowledge about energy. When I go back 7 years, if you sat next to somebody you'd not met before and you said, oh, I'm in energy, and you could see their eyes glazing over immediately and thinking, how do I get out of this quickly? Now they say, well, what about this idea? What about this? I've read about this. Will this work? And so for people who have part of the answer, not the whole answer, but part of it, then you are the ones who should be really out there proselytizing this and telling others about what you see as being part of those solutions and engaging and enthusiasing people into this sector. We have to transform this sector in the course of the next few years. This is an incredible time for innovation and for invention. That the way we generate electricity, the way we transmit it, all of these issues are going to be changing in the course of the next few years, and the way we use it above all. And those will be growing out of universities, they'll be growing out of the businesses which are represented here. And you are the change makers, so don't hold back. Go out there and see this conference as being part of that process of encouraging you to be out there and to turn around the minds of people who are sceptical or just unclear about those issues. I really want to see something like the Space Agency, the National Space Agency, to see a National Energy Agency, where young people, schools from around the country can all go there and they can get a better understanding of how all of this works, how it ties together. That I think is so important that we should be using this moment to engage people, because it is an incredibly exciting debate. And there's a whole bunch of geniuses in this room who are undoubtedly an important part of that solution. So thank you for inviting me to be part of it, and it's been a huge privilege to do so.